Our guest today was born in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, but he holds a bachelor and master's degree in science and geology from San Diego State University. Isn't that wonderful? He began his career with Conoco in 1984 in Lafayette, Indiana. He has since worked for ConocoPhillips in New Orleans, London, Aberdeen, Houston, Anchorage, Farmington, and Singapore. Wow. He has obviously been very, very successful. He has a hugely important leadership role with ConocoPhillips. And when the opportunity arose to have him come to San Diego and speak, I first thought of the partnership with Rotary, which we greatly loved. And I thought this was a fitting venue and place for him. Welcome, please, the General Manager, Non-Conventional Resources, ConocoPhillips, a great American company, Gregory Leveille.
Well, George, thank you for that very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be here with a group that has so much positive energy. I think George hit the nail on the head when he talked about the fact that much of what we see in the world is very negative news. And what I hope I can do today is share with you a story which should get us all very much encouraged about the future of America, because it's a story which really is evolving and one that can make an enormous difference to our country's future. It's good to be back here in San Diego. I moved away 30 years ago. It's been a while since I've been here, and the city's changed enormously. It's gotten a lot bigger, and the thing I noticed is it's got a lot more high-tech industry here than it did back in the day when I was a student at San Diego State. I had a chance this morning to visit my alma mater and talk to some of the students and faculty out there, and that was a really refreshing experience. San Diego State has grown, it's evolved, and the students were really excited to hear about what's happening in the oil and gas industry, since many of our employees come from universities like San Diego State with degrees in engineering or science. I probably should disclose up front that not only do I have the tie to San Diego State University, but there's a lot of other family ties I have to California. My wife and her family is actually from the Bay Area, a little ways up the coast. My son Ryan has done something which is a little bit unusual in that he graduated from the University of Texas a couple years back and decided to leave Texas, and is living up the coast in LA and starting his career in commercial real estate. And then finally, just full disclosure, in the next 5 or 10 years, my wife and I intend to retire to California, since it's probably the state we've most enjoyed living in out of all the places that George mentioned that we've been. So California is really, really important to me. It's important to my family, and it's also important to the oil and gas industry. So if you look at California, I think most people don't realize California is the third largest oil producing state in the nation. It's a little bit behind Alaska, and it's a little bit ahead of Alaska and behind only Texas and North Dakota. So a lot of oil and gas production comes from your state. 17 of the 100 largest oil fields ever discovered are here in California. And there's been many, many generations of oil and gas industry employees who have worked here in your state. California is also, as you know, the second largest gasoline market in the nation. So the automobile culture here is out of this world, right? People love their cars, and there's a passion there for motor vehicles, and of course most of those motor vehicles run on gasoline. And then maybe the thing which every American realizes is that California really is a bellwether state in that it sets a lot of the trends that eventually sweep across our nation. So when we think about California from a ConocoPhillips perspective, we realize it's important, and important for a number of different reasons. We're really out trying to talk with people in various communities and get a sense of what's on their mind. That's why I'm here today. That's why I've traveled to places like Miami, Florida, to Austin, Texas, Colorado, and various other states. And the message we keep hearing is that there's kind of two things which are really, really important to Americans that have to do with the energy industry. And that's firstly to be able to have clean and affordable energy. So clean and affordable energy would be number one. And then the second item would really be associated with job creation and economic development. So most people would like to have a very vibrant economy. I mean, it's so important to our future, and as George was mentioning, the Rotary Club is really all about that. When you look at these two needs, I think California epitomizes both of them, and maybe perhaps the story around economic growth is the one that maybe is more important or more critical at this time, because California still is suffering more than most from the Great Recession. You know the numbers. Unemployment here is almost 9%. It's 2% above the national average, and I think it's the 5th highest in the nation. So if you look at the California economy, it really does need a bit of a boost to get going forward. And this is very different from what I remember about California when I was young. When I was young, California was always the leader in the economy and innovation, many superlatives about the state, and I sense that California can recapture that position again going forward. I know my son living in LA, Ryan, very much believes that in the industry that he's working in. So in my talk today, I'll try to touch on all these topics, and like I said, there's a message in here which I think is incredibly important for Americans to hear, and a message about the future of our energy industry and some really new opportunities that are available as a result of this energy revolution that's underway in America today. To give you an idea of the scale of the revolution, if you turn the clock back to the year 2000, you see a world in which America was likely to be beholden to others for our energy needs for decades and decades to come. And back then, the conventional wisdom was that the U.S. was going to run out of natural gas in the not-too-distant future. That's the case because if you look around the coastlines of America, coastlines of Canada and Mexico, a large number of terminals were built to import liquefied natural gas, or what people call LNG, into this country. So we had been once the largest natural gas producer, but the future looked very grim. We were going to have to be using imported natural gas. And if you turn to the oil side of the industry, it was even a more desperate story. So America was once the largest oil producer on the planet. It had peak production in 1970 of over 11 million barrels of oil per day. But from the 70s onward, that oil production had been falling and falling for years and decades, and had reached a point where we were producing less than 7 million barrels a day. So we got up to a point where over 60% of the oil we were using was coming from foreign sources. So we were basically beholden to others, and really the mindset was one of resource scarcity, and how do we remain a vibrant economy if so much of our energy is coming from beyond our shores. If we jump back to the present, I think you sense from probably what you've seen in the media and hopefully what I tell you today that the picture is very, very different. Natural gas production has climbed enormously in the last 8 years. So we went from producing around 50 billion cubic feet of gas per day, which is a measure of volume, to over 70 billion cubic feet of gas per day here in 2013. So in about 8 years' time, about a 40% increase in the volume of natural gas being produced in our country. The U.S. is now believed, in fact, to have over a century of natural gas reserves that would allow us to produce at current or higher rates. So we've gone from a country where we were expecting to be an enormous importer to being a country which will actually be exporting liquefied natural gas here in the not-too-distant future, probably by 2015. We're back as the #1 producer on the planet. We passed Russia around 2010. And really the story has changed enormously as far as natural gas. That's happened over an 8-year time frame. The more recent events that really are spectacular have to do with oil production. So if you just go back to 2008, production, as I said, was around 7 million barrels of oil per day, and it was falling fairly rapidly. Today, production is over 10 million barrels of oil per day, and it's growing at a faster pace than anywhere else on the planet. Imports are down. We're now importing only about a third of our oil into America. You can imagine what that does for our balance of trade payments. And together with the U.S. and Canada, if you put those two countries together, probably by 2020, North America will be self-sufficient for oil production, which is just a startling reversal of events. So our energy security, it's vastly improved. You saw perhaps in the Union Tribune just in the last month that the U.S. is now the world's largest oil and gas producer on a combined basis. So if you look on a barrel oil equivalent basis, we produce now more combined energy in oil and gas than any country on the planet, with Russia having previously been the largest producer. So a world of enormous change. And this flood of new production, it stabilized or even cut the energy prices to U.S. consumers. So one of the things which is driving this energy and economic renaissance, which is starting in states like Texas, is the price of natural gas today in America is significantly below that in other world markets. So 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas you can purchase for $3 to $4 in the U.S. In Europe, it costs $8 to $10, and in Asia, it's about $15. So you talk about competitive advantages. Think about what that does for America's manufacturers. We have some of the lowest cost energy for those using natural gas. It's also reduced the volatility we see in the price of natural gas, so there's less volatility, lower prices. And this has all been made possible because of resources that have been found in a rock called shale. I mean, you've probably heard that term bantered around a fair bit, shale gas, shale oil. Shale turns out to be a rock that is the most abundant sedimentary rock type in our planet. It turns out that not very many shales have large amounts of oil and gas in them, but luckily there are a few special situations in which these rocks can contain significant amounts of these two resources. You know, we've known this for decades. In fact, it's a little bit embarrassing as a geologist to be up here talking about shale, because when I went to university, people thought of these shales as the source rocks, the place where oil and gas came from and then migrated through the Earth's crust to what are the conventional traps where oil and gas are generally extracted. But it turns out that, you know, even though we were extracting oil and gas from the Earth's crust for 150 years, we had somewhat overlooked the biggest accumulations of oil and gas resources, which were right back in these source rocks. So we've been able to develop some amazing technology which allows us to go in and access that oil and gas, and it has really created a situation where the performance of the oil and gas industry in America today is the envy of the entire world. No other country on our planet is seeing this type of growth in production, and it's creating enormous opportunities for our country. Some of these technologies are trying to be deployed elsewhere on our planet, but you know, frankly, there are many special things about America. It's not so much that our rocks are special, but if you look at the regulatory environment, the infrastructure we have here, the fiscal terms, and the rule of law, there's many special things about America that has allowed this revolution to happen here before anywhere else on the planet. So it's completely changed the energy landscape, and it's created what I would describe as a revolution. It's generating immense benefits at a time, I think, when our nation needs these probably the most. It's helping to bring the U.S. economy back. If you've been to Texas or some of the other oil-producing states, you'll be amazed at the amount of economic growth that's happening there. And it's making us a very viable competitor in things like chemical production and manufacturing. And I think probably the other thing, the story which maybe would be the biggest surprise to a group like this is you probably can see the energy security side of this oil and gas revolution as being a very positive thing. You can think about the economic stimulation, but there's also an incredibly good environmental story to go along with this as well. We really feel like within ConocoPhillips, it's not a situation where we need to choose between oil and gas production and environmental stewardship. It's really a situation where you can have both. And to give you some proof points around that, if you look at natural gas, you know, it's an incredibly clean burning fuel. It's one of the cleanest burning fuels available in the kind of the portfolio of fuels that are produced naturally within the Earth's crust. The reason for this, it's a very simple molecule, right? If any of you are chemical engineers, you know that methane is made up of 1 carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms, and when it burns incredibly cleanly. And this is really allowing the country to reduce not only its dependence on foreign sources of oil and gas, but to dramatically reduce our carbon CO2 output, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. If you look at natural gas in California, I mean, there's some really important links between the California economy and natural gas. Natural gas, it provides nearly 28% of your total energy needs here in California. Generates about half of California's electricity, supplies heating and cooking fuel to 7 out of every 10 homes in your state, serves as a feedstock for all of the fertilizer that's produced here, which is used to make California such a great success story as far as food production. And it also powers fleets of vehicles like the buses and service and delivery trucks that you see being powered by CNG here in the state of California. So it really is a type of fuel which is important not just to America as a whole, but to California. If you look at the situation as far as employment here in California, you see also some very significant linkages between natural gas and employment. There's about 900,000 people in the state that are directly or indirectly involved with the oil and gas industry, and that's about 4% of the state's workforce. These jobs associated with natural gas generate about $62 billion in annual income and nearly $132 billion in total economic stimulation. So California is a very, very significant natural gas consumer. ConocoPhillips doesn't produce any natural gas in the state, but we do produce natural gas in New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Western Canada, which comes to your state via pipeline. So California is important to us for that reason. If you look at the national scene, the oil and gas industry is one of the biggest industries in our country. It makes up about 8% of the U.S.'s gross domestic product. So, you know, even for California, I think you'll agree that's a big number. And the job creation that is associated with oil and gas really extends far beyond the oil and gas producing states. You've seen recently the advent of natural gas production on the east coast of America with the Marcellus formation in states like Pennsylvania. And if you look at the numbers associated with jobs growth in Pennsylvania, almost 200,000 jobs have been created in the last 8 years from the natural gas production in that state. So very, very important in Pennsylvania and the other states along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. In fact, if you look at the potential for natural gas production, what we've seen here is that the supplies that are available are of such a scale that we are going to be able to use this resource for decades and decades to come. That it's not going to be a bridge fuel necessarily to another future, but actually an integral part of America's energy landscape for many, many decades. There are also other benefits associated with natural gas production, with some of the most exciting of these, as I mentioned, being environmental benefits. We really think that the use of natural gas can help us with both short-term and long-term environmental goals. For example, you know, short-term things in California, you've done a lot to clean up the air here over the last half century. Natural gas has been part of that story because it doesn't emit any smog-producing chemicals when it's burned in electric plants. Other important environmental aspects of natural gas is it really has a very, very small footprint. The production of natural gas, you get a lot of energy in a concentrated area, so it's about 1/20th of the footprint of equivalent wind energy. And electric plants fueled by natural gas use 60% less water than coal plants. So it also ties into the minimization of water usage, which I know is very important here in the state of California. In fact, if you look at what many scientists now believe, if we are, as a world, going to cut back our CO2 emissions, natural gas is going to have to play an enormous role in doing that because the scale of the CO2 emissions coming from coal in places like Asia are such that without using natural gas to displace coal, we're not going to be able to, as a planet, reduce our CO2 emissions. So a number of benefits associated with using natural gas as an important source of energy. If you look at the annual U.S. emissions of carbon dioxide, as I mentioned, natural gas has played a role in reducing those, and I don't know how many Americans realize this. If you look at our CO2 emissions, they had been growing, obviously, for decades and decades of time. Today, they're back at levels not seen since the early 1990s. So if you look at what has caused that, alternatives have played a role, energy conservation has played a role, but the single biggest driver on that has been the substitution of natural gas in place of coal in the electricity sector. So an absolutely incredible story there for America and the part that natural gas is playing in cutting back on CO2 production. And another thing which is, I think, important to California, where alternative energy sources are so much being put in place, is that there's times at which the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and you're going to need an alternative source of energy. If you look at natural gas, it is one of the most flexible fuels to use in electricity generation. So those plants can be turned on very quickly and allow the electricity from alternative energy to be put into the grid in a very effective manner. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the energy revolution, it's now expanded into the production of liquid hydrocarbons. And, so I've talked a lot about natural gas, but the oil story, I think, is one that will probably be one that you'll see in the press more and more here in the years to come. And liquid production is booming, and it's really booming in states like Texas and North Dakota. In North Dakota, you have the Bakken trend, and in Texas, you have trends called the Eagle Ford and the Permian Basin. And if you look at the impact, for example, on North Dakota now has the lowest unemployment rate of any state in the nation. I mean, you have to be working pretty hard not to find a job if you're living in North Dakota. I think it's down around 2%. If you look at the impact on Texas, it's perhaps even more amazing. So most people know that OPEC is a large cartel which controls oil production around the planet. So if you go back to the year 2010 and you looked at Texas's production and you compared that to the OPEC nations, what you would have found was that Texas's production would have been behind 11 out of the 12 OPEC producing nations. So a relatively small amount of oil production, about 1 million barrels a day. If you look at the summer of this year, by the summer of this year, oil production in Texas had grown to where it was now ahead of 7 of the 12 nations. By the end of the year, we'll pass 2 more, and sometime in 2014, America will be producing, or Texas will be producing more oil than every OPEC nation except for Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's one of our states here in America, and isn't that an incredible story? I mean, it's a story which is very encouraging because, if you look at California, there is a similar type of potential here in the state in shale resources. You've heard about the Monterey, the Kreinhagen shales. California, as I said, was one of the big producing states as far as conventional resources. ConocoPhillips isn't actively at this point pursuing these types of formations here in California, but there's lots of companies that are. And if you look at what is really going to be the critical factor in determining whether California's production follows the path that Texas's production has followed, I think it's going to have a lot to do with the will of men, more so than the rocks that are in the ground. There's so much political and public acceptability issues around shale development that people like you, people who can influence public opinion and who can help get the facts out about this enormous resource, are going to make a big difference as to whether or not shale production goes ahead in California. And it's really important, I think, to a group like this, because if you look at what U.S.A. came out with when they studied the potential from shale oil production in California, what they found was it could create 2.8 million jobs by 2020. It could increase the state's economic output by 14%, could raise aggregate personal income by 10%, and would create nearly $25 billion of new tax revenue at the state and local level. So, I mean, that's U.S.A.'s view on how big the prize is here in the state of California. And of course, if you look at California, that would really help the state. It helped the state in many ways. I mean, I don't know if you realize it, but today the state imports the vast majority of its crude oil. Only about 37% of the crude oil is produced here in California. About 12% comes from Alaska, and half of your crude oil comes from overseas. I mean, so that's a pretty big number, and much bigger than the national average. So development of shale resources here in California could help rebalance that number. It could create jobs within the state and really add to the vitality of the state of California's government. And if you look at it, for the amount of resources that could be available, you know, even for a state as big as California, this would make a difference, right? It's really a situation where the abundance is of a scale that it should be something that the state of California makes a conscious decision about whether they should pursue it or not. And the new abundance of natural gas really is making a difference as far as U.S. competitiveness. I mentioned this a bit. If you look at the energy revolution, it's revised the chemical industry. Because if you look at what the chemical industry utilizes, it utilizes oil and gas as basically that feedstock to create all the things that are used in modern manufacturing. So it's not just about the energy created with oil and gas, it's also about the feedstocks that are used in the chemical industries which drive the manufacturing which we find in our country. I mentioned that shale production is a relatively new capability. It was made possible around the turn of the century when we started to combine two proven technologies in a very innovative way. So in many cases, innovation is thought of as creating something new, but if you look at the revolution in shales, it's about combining two very old technologies. You've heard about both of these. One is hydraulic fracturing. And I don't think most people realize hydraulic fracturing is something that's been used in the oil and gas industry for over 70 years. There's been over 1 million wells that have been hydraulically fractured, so this is certainly not a new technology. But what was required to access the resources out of these shales was to combine that with horizontal drilling, where we go down and drill a well into the Earth's crust, maybe a mile or more into the subsurface, and then go laterally for a mile or more horizontally in a target horizon. And the ability to actually hydraulically fracture horizontal wells is something that's fairly new. And this combination is what's unlocked the enormous potential that I've been talking about. If we think about this process here, it really gives us a powerful machine for job creation, economic stimulation, and emissions reduction. And by capturing this full potential, you know, we really can change the trajectory of our country in the 21st century. But to do this, we're going to have to overcome a number of challenges, and we recognize that in the oil and gas industry. First, our industry recognizes that we must always continue to innovate, minimizing the environmental impacts that we have, and enhancing safety and efficiency. Second, we must overcome some mistaken public perceptions, several of which are front and center in the news today. I mean, one which is pretty common is what you might call the silver bullet myth, the idea that there's some unknown source of energy out there which is going to be able to come forward, which would be clean, extremely low cost, and easy to deploy. I mean, I think if you look around America, there's an enormous amount of innovation going on today in energy, but there is no one energy source which has all the attributes that America would want. Natural gas, we think, comes close. You know, it's here today, it's abundant, it's affordable, it's clean, burning compared to coal, and the production and delivery systems needed to utilize that resource already exist. So we think there's a number of attributes of natural gas which make this a fuel of choice. And likewise for oil, you know, for a country which is using 18 million barrels of oil per day, the ability to increase our oil production makes an enormous difference in the economic well-being of our country. That's not to say that oil and gas are the only energy sources we need. President Obama says, you know, we really need this all-of-above type approach, and at ConocoPhillips we strongly believe that. You know, we need to be able to use fossil fuels, biofuels, wind and solar, and even some sources perhaps which we don't recognize today. And this will really, I think, become more and more true as the economy recovers. We've been in the last few years in an economic funk, where economic growth's been very low and energy growth has been low as well. But as the economy begins to revive here in the years ahead, we're going to need more sources of energy. I think it's unfortunate, however, if you look at this, there is, of course, an enormous threat to the possibility of the continuation of this success story here in America, and that has to do with perceptions that hydraulic fracturing is something which needs to be stopped. When we look at this, as I said, there's been millions of wells that have been hydraulically fractured. The EPA has studied this many, many times in the past, and every time they study it, they decide that no new regulations are needed and that there is no systemic threat from hydraulic fracturing. In fact, if you look at some of the statements by the former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, she said multiple times that there are no confirmed instances of groundwater contamination caused by fracturing. And there are new EPA studies underway. Many universities are studying this. We expect more and more results in this space, but we're very confident that those studies are going to find that hydraulic fracturing is not a concern of the scale that some of the opponents of oil and gas development would make it out to be. There are other concerns associated with the drilling of oil and gas wells, the construction of the wells, the surety of isolating the wellbore from groundwater and other subsurface formations. But if you look at that, there's been millions of wells drilled in the U.S., and once again, no systemic problems ever found with well construction issues. So we think many of the concerns which are being voiced are ones that the industry has ways to address. We think it's therefore reasonable to believe that we can do this safely. We've demonstrated it over many decades. We do believe that there is a role for government oversight. We're not trying to suggest that, thank you, Pauline. We're not trying to suggest that regulation isn't important, but we really want the regulation to be fit for purpose. If you look at Texas, one of the things that allowed this oil and gas resource revolution to occur in Texas is the fact that the regulations there are very much fit for purpose. They recognize that many of the fluids used in hydraulic fracturing are ones you find in your home, and that the risk involved are very, very low. We think that the states really need to be the regulating bodies. I mean, if you think about regulation in Washington, sometimes that's a very scary thing. We don't think they understand our industry and probably don't understand your industry as well. So there's challenges out there. ConocoPhillips is certainly striving to address those challenges. We're reaching out. We're talking to people in communities. We recognize this is a large-scale industrial process, and it's new in some areas. In Texas, it's not such a new thing, but if you go to the East Coast and perhaps in some areas on the West Coast, it is. In reaching out to the communities, we really recognize that public engagement with groups like yours is so important. And we really want to share that message that you can have both energy abundance, economic growth, as well as environmental surety. We believe that by cooperating together on these things, we can make a difference, and we do thank you for the time to come here and talk with you today. Thank you so much. Okay. Pauline, you have a question there.
One question, Steve Trevor.
One question with 3 parts.
Okay.
What's the cost-benefit analysis of shale extraction in terms of energy? How does that compare to other methodologies? Number 2, in light of the increased production, what accounts for the spikes in the price of gas at the pump? And number 3, quick comment on the Keystone Pipeline.
Sure. So on the first one, the energy balance, things which have surprised the oil and gas industry, one is that we could extract oil and gas from these rocks. They're very low permeability, and frankly, when I went to university, nobody thought that oil and gas could come out of these rocks at commercial rates. But an even bigger surprise is it's coming out of the rocks at rates which are tremendously economic. So what we're finding is that these are some of the most profitable investments available to our company and to the U.S. oil and gas industry. So the energy balance is very, very favorable, and these resources, even with natural gas prices falling to $3, $4 an MCF, there is still economic margin to be made for drilling for natural gas. So, I mean, I think that's a reasonably good proof point on that. Your second question was on, remind me there, that's the problem with getting 3 questions at once. Price of gasoline. So price of gasoline depends on lots of different things. You know, everything from what's happening around the globe, upsets in Libya and Iran, geopolitical events, you know, what the regulations are around the type of gasoline that needs to be produced during different times of the years in different states. Frankly, you know, only a modest amount of that pricing volatility has to do with the actual production. I mean, if you actually look at U.S. oil prices, they are also lower than oil prices anywhere else in the world. So oil in America is selling for 10 to 15% less than oil in other parts of the planet. So although, you know, the price may seem high at the pump, it's actually a bargain on a world basis. And your last one was on the Keystone Pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline, as many of you know, is meant to bring oil out of Canada down to America. I guess when we look at it as a company, we believe that any type of infrastructure that makes the oil and gas industry more connected and makes it more flexible is beneficial in the long term to consumers and to the economy. So we'd be supportive of things like the Keystone Pipeline, which we think creates both economic growth as well as energy security for America. So thank you for those 3 questions.